So this is Pivotal States. This is a longstanding series that we have here at the Carnegie Endowment. I'm Chris Chivvis, the director of the American Statecraft Program. We've moved Pivotal States from an event format to a podcast format, and this is the first installment in that new podcast format that we're doing. I'm really excited to be here with some of my favorite analysts of foreign policy in Washington, Stephen Wertheim, Matt Duss, and Brett Rosenberg. We've just finished a trip to Taiwan where we learned an enormous amount, not only about Taiwanese politics, but also about the bigger strategic picture and what the United States might be able to do about it. We're at a moment where, U.S. foreign policy is, disruptive, to say the least, going in directions that are unclear in a lot of areas. And one of the directions where I think it's unclear, and we can talk about this if you guys want, is on China policy, what the future of the Trump administration's China policy is going to look like. So anyway, given all of that, we thought it would be a good idea to go to Taiwan, which is really sort of at the center of the maelstrom here, and try to get a sense of what, what it looked like from the island itself. And there's obviously tons of different issues that we can talk about and that we did talk about on the trip. You've got the state of Taiwan's own democracy, the nature of its domestic politics. You've got the condition of cross-strait relations. That's the relations between Taipei and Beijing. You've got also one of the things we want to talk about is how they're viewing the United States and how are they making sense of the Trump administration and its policies towards Ukraine and other parts of the world. And then finally, since it's Taiwan, the military dimension is always really important. And there are lots of other things that we could talk about. But if it's okay with you guys, I thought we might just start with domestic politics and then move to the larger strategic questions. For me, I think on the domestic politics is where my eyes were opened the most as someone who's not a resident China expert to the complications of Taiwan's domestic politics and the way in which those complications affect the broader strategic picture, that we're talking about when we're talking about U.S.-China relations and security across all of East Asia. And the thing that really struck me was the extent to which the politics of Taiwan are just so badly polarized and weirdly reminiscent of the United States, right? So at the same time, I was there and I was thinking, okay, this is bad for Taiwan, but also it's an interesting case study in the effects of polarization.
Absolutely. This was certainly a striking element of the trip. It seemed like if we were talking to somebody from the DPP, the ruling Democratic Progressive Party, it would be only a matter of time until they would express their animosity towards the other side, the KMT, the Kuomintang, in part because over the past year plus, there has been this rivalry between the two. The DPP won the presidency for a record third straight term. So President Tsai was replaced by her vice president, now President Lai. But the KMT ended up gaining the plurality of seats in the legislature. And since that point, the two sides have been at each other's throats, not only trying to obstruct the moves of the other one on policy grounds, but also trying to claw some of the power, the institutional power of the executive branch into the legislature, if it's the KMT, or vice versa. This is an executive branch that's also trying to do big things to mobilize society. So, and then if we were talking to a KMT figure, once again, only a matter of time until they would suggest that the DPP was leading Taiwan down the path toward ruin. And, I think this matters for Taiwan,
bunch of
for
unreasonable
sure.
radicals was sort of the impression that you got from talking to the KMT.
We had one person refer to the DPP as the DEI party, clearly importing in some American.
But I think they would have been proud of that based upon what we heard. So it's kind of, but anyway, this gets into
that some of the DPP people would bring up, for example, in a conversation about foreign policy, the fact that the DPP championed rights for same-sex marriage. And they did so early in an East Asian context. So that's clearly part of the identity of this party. But I think this matters for the strength of Taiwan's own democracy. It also matters for the United States because it's very hard to forge a consensus in that system around an approach toward the United States and toward the PRC.
Yeah, I'd say knowing kind of a little bit about Taiwan's domestic politics, but not a lot, I think we were able to dive in at a much, much deeper level that I really appreciated. And in a way, it's the positions of the two parties on the various domestic versus foreign policies are almost counterintuitive, right? The KMT, this is the Chinese Nationalist Party that literally fought a war against the Communist Party and retreated to the island of Taiwan and still nominally claims to be the rightful government of all of China, and yet they are the ones who have the ongoing conversation with the CCP. Any channels that the Taiwanese government has are basically through the KMT. The DPP is much more forward-leaning in terms of an independent Taiwanese identity separate from the Chinese mainland. And yet, even though it seems a bit more hawkish on the foreign policy side when it comes to domestic issues, gay rights, women's rights, a whole range of things that we associate with progressive politics here in the United States. I thought that was really interesting, but and I do think it's important always, to understand as much as possible the domestic drivers of any country's politics, because ultimately that is what in democracies politicians, I hate to break it to people, but are mainly concerned with. How do I get reelected? How do I stay in power? How do I manage my own political coalition? So that's something that we have to contend with as we try to come to our own decisions about U.S. policy.
Yeah, and I was struck as well by, there's obviously this polarization between the two parties, but there was an understanding that the public, I think, is much closer to where the DPP's view is on sort of the cross-strait approach. Not necessarily in terms of a hawkish approach, but in terms of we're already an independent sovereign nation, right? We have an independent Taiwanese identity. And the KMT approach, it seemed like they even recognized that a lot of young people especially were not particularly drawn to any sort of form of reconciliation with China. That said, there is a large, sizable majority that wants to maintain the status quo. And so reconciling those two things, a strong national Taiwanese identity with wanting to maintain an increasingly tenuous status quo, is something that the DPP is clearly struggling to uphold.
Yeah, I agree, and I think we should get into that maybe a little bit more deeply in a couple of minutes, but I want to just stick with the question of sort of polarization and what appears to be increasingly dysfunctional politics in Taiwan right now. So you've got the recall, right, which it struck me, and I was glad that we had the opportunity to hear from a couple of, objective observers who were outside of the politics of this, who basically were saying, so this is the effort by the DPP to basically overturn the election of some 35 KMT members of the LY, the Taiwanese parliament. I was glad that we had the opportunity to hear from some of those objective people who were outside of the political fray who said, look, this isn't so democratic of the DPP to try to do this. After all, those people were elected, and they're clearly doing it because they just want to get control of parliament back. But it speaks to this sort of, they justify it oftentimes by saying that, well, the KMT is essentially the party of China. It's almost as if they don't believe that followers of the KMT are part of the same country, if in which they do believe Taiwan is, obviously. And so that sense of clash was very clear to me. And the other angle of it was we arrived just after the case of a woman who had been deported back to mainland China for saying very pro-Chinese things. I mean, frankly, some really crazy stuff, like she thought China should invade Taiwan, stuff that clearly is not cool. We don't know the background, whether or not she was actually getting paid by the Chinese security services or anything along those lines. And so they deported her. Maybe that was a decision that was made with some information that we don't know. But the thing that struck me was how sanguine so many of the DPP representatives who we talked to were about it when we raised, for example, but that's not great, right? We understand that what she was saying wasn't cool, but like to deport her, like doesn't that raise issues of freedom of speech? And it's complicated when you're talking about disinformation. But for me, it was just an example of how, adversary disinformation does more damage than the disinformation itself. When it really makes basic trust in our capacity to communicate with opposition parties break down, and it really makes me worried about Taiwan.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was not that this person was charged with activities like that. There were ideas that were expressed that were deemed so harmful to the security of Taiwan. And obviously that is a huge problem. As the same with the recall effort, right, is kind of a foundational principle of democracy is that you respect outcomes of elections when they don't go your way, and you try again next time. Obviously, we see echoes of all these problems here in our country. We should be humble about that. But it does really kind of show the increasingly zero-sum nature of their politics. That's the phrase that kept ringing around in my head as we heard both sides describing the other.
I just kept thinking about how hard it is to have a vibrant, flourishing democracy with this threat of invasion kind of constantly overhead. It activates, I think, sort of the worst impulses in democracy, including just the suspicion of one's fellow citizens, one's fellow non-citizens, and the opposition. It turns a sort of loyal opposition into potential plants, right, of the CCP, and that's what the assumption is.
Right, and a warning sign for democracy anywhere is when the political parties hate each other so much, distrust each other so much, that they are willing to take liberties with the rule of law, with the election system, in order to prevent that other side from gaining power. And so there's a pretty clear reason why this would be a concern for Taiwanese with the threat of the PRC across the strait. We have similar dynamics in the United States without that kind of threat. Nevertheless, there was a real disjuncture between, I think, what we encountered and the strength on paper of Taiwan's democracy, which is quite an inspiring story if you go back to the period of martial law and the progress of Taiwan's democracy since the 80s.
I mean, what you say, Brett, about feeling the pressure from China is something that we shouldn't skip over because it's very real, right? I mean, both on the disinformation side, I mean, the concern is real. I have no doubt that that's actually going on and in an aggressive way. And then also you've got obviously the gray zone activities that we all know about and which came up in almost every conversation that we were having. And these are the consistent efforts of the PRC using the PLA to try to threaten and encroach upon Taiwan whenever they're unhappy with anything that either Taiwan does or potentially also the United States does, which puts Taiwan in a difficult position. And I completely agree that that makes it hard to have a functioning democracy, and we should be cognizant of that. Yet, Taiwan's claim to democracy is one of the main things that they are putting out there as the justification for why the United States ought to be willing to risk a war with China in order to defend Taiwan. And let's be clear about it, a war with China would be a massive conflagration. We're not talking about what a war with China would have looked like in 1990 or in 1978. We're talking about what a war with China would look like in the late 2020s. And that is a very different story and a very scary one.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about nuclear World War III, effectively.
Quite possibly.
Quite possibly. And I think, to your point, though, about Taiwan, I think, especially during the Biden administration, it was putting out as one of its main reasons that the U.S. should be defending it, that we are a vibrant democracy, that the democracies around the world need to stand together, need to fight the rising tide of authoritarianism. Obviously, under President Trump, and maybe we want to get into this later, their approach has changed. They're no longer necessarily putting forth as their main reason that the U.S. should come to defend them, that democracy is the reason, right? There's a lot of other things that I don't know if we want to shift
other
there.
arguments. Yeah, please talk about that. Yeah.
Heard about having cards.
Right,
Yes.
exactly. And so, as Matt said, one of the things that constantly that came up a bunch was clearly the Zelensky-Trump scene in the Oval Office resonated. We heard different interpretations in different ways. Some people repeated the line that I think has been in the news quite a bit, which was Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow. This idea that this bodes ill for Taiwan. Some referred to that as Chinese propaganda. It wouldn't surprise me if Chinese propaganda was spreading that, but it also seems like a reasonable interpretation that some people might have. And as Matt said, people kept coming back to this quote where Trump turned to Zelensky and said, "You don't have the cards," saying that Ukraine just didn't have the cards to stand up to Russia. And that seemed to activate in quite a few of our interlocutors the notion that Taiwan needs to get some cards. And I think that came up in two ways. One, they need to get some cards because they need to be able to deter an invasion, and if necessary, withstand it, fight back, things like that. But two, they need to be able to prove to the United States that they have cards so as to then bring the U.S. in. And so, the cards sort of on the first front are things like raising the defense budget to 3%, increasing military service from 4 months to a year, doing sort of whole of society resilience and civil defense efforts, just really trying to strengthen their deterrence and defense capability. On the other side, with clearly trying to signal to Trump, some of that is related, right? That first part about raising the defense budget to 3%, that is clearly something Donald Trump would like to hear, though he will see that as below a floor, I think, as he's expressed and other members of his administration.
Well, we've heard all kinds of numbers.
5%, 10%,
yeah,
right.
Why not make it 25%?
We certainly
Exactly.
haven't heard 3%.
3%.
So 3% is not going to cut
Exactly.
it.
So I think they saw 3% as the first step. They also, though, in what two other things that are, I think, clearer signals to Donald Trump. One is trade imbalances, right? They're trying to deal with that by purchase agreements, especially around LNG. They recently signed a letter of intent with the Alaska governor to have LNG imports from the new North Slope project in Alaska. And then the third thing was a new $100 billion commitment from TSMC for semiconductor fabs built in the United States. That's on top of their already $65 billion commitment. So that's pretty massive.
I mean, I sort of felt like with those three, dimensions, they were fairly confident, or at least more confident than I would have expected about the future of the relationship with the United States. They seemed less shaken by the Zelensky Oval Office beating that had only taken place, 2 or 3 weeks before our arrival there. I mean, I expected them to be much more worried than they were. But I don't know, Matt, you seem to feel that maybe there was more concern there than I saw.
I think it's a bit more concern, and just as Brett said, they had clearly heard that line. But they were a bit more, I guess, sanguine about the fact that, no, Taiwan does have cards that Ukraine does not, TSMC being the most obvious example.
Right, sure. But we have a long-standing commitment to Taiwan that we did not have to Ukraine.
That's also true. I mean, they again, placing a lot of stock in the kind of long-standing political and kind of cultural role that Taiwan has played in this relationship and in going back to the Cold War. But it's also a general sense. I mean, to put I guess the nicest possible spin on Trump's approach, it's generally, we're getting ripped off. These people are ripping us off. They should stop ripping us off. And from Taiwan's perspective, it's okay, how can we show that we're not just consumers of American prosperity and security, but we're also contributing to American prosperity, but also to our own security, and to erase any concept that we are free riding or ripping Americans off. So again, the announcement of a rise in the defense budget is definitely a part of that. The announcement, all the things that Brett talked about, I think is a part of that. So again, I wouldn't overstate the amount of alarm, but I do think some people were perhaps a bit too relaxed and placing a bit too much stock in this kind of idea that, Americans will always support Taiwan, because maybe Americans, when you poll them, but the question is, will they punish a politician or a president who changes that?
Actually, when you poll Americans, only 30-some% say that they would support coming to the direct defense of Taiwan against a Chinese attack. That's a fairly low number if you compare that to the number that say that they would support defending a NATO ally, including the Baltic states. Mm-hmm. These polls are only so valuable, but a notably higher percentage of the Taiwan public thinks that the United States would fight for Taiwan than Americans do. So I think there's an important gap there. And I share your worry, Matt, that there might be some overconfidence in Taipei right now about where things could go with the Trump administration. So some of the things that we heard reminded me a little bit of the position that Zelensky was trying to take in his Oval Office meeting with Trump, where Trump would say, look, first you got to make peace, you got to reach out, you got to compromise, and then we worry about the costly stuff for the United States, the security guarantees. I think the Trump administration will want to see Taiwan step up on defense, which Taiwan to an extent is willing to do. But the approach of the current government, led by President Lai, is to also kind of verbally shake his fist across the strait and be very assertive about the fact that there is a separate government in Taipei and Beijing. We've seen that throughout his less than a year of his tenure, and that's the kind of thing where I think the Trump administration has not yet focused on Taiwan as a problem yet. So I think some in Taiwan think that they're not having a problem yet, and they're reading a green light from Washington. I think simply the Trump administration has not had a review of Taiwan policy, or events have not forced them to focus on the problem. So I could see some friction appear somewhat suddenly in the coming months, years.
Do you think the administration has some either strategic or non-strategic ambiguity about this, right? Either because they haven't addressed it on a diplomatic level, or because of some of the statements that Trump versus his administration, fellow officials have said, right? Trump, right before he came into office, basically said, we are like an insurance company, effectively, right? We provide insurance to Taiwan. Where's the payment, right? Exactly as Matt said, like.
Nice way to put it.
Yeah, exactly.
A protection racket.
Exactly. But if folks saw reporting about the interim national defense strategic guidance that just came out, it labeled China as the sole pacing threat for the Department of Defense, and deterring an invasion of Taiwan as the sole pacing scenario. And so you can read lots of different things into lots of different appendages of the Trump administration, whether it's the president or some of his advisors. I think in the end, a lot of my view is it comes down to the president in this particular administration, and they may well be misreading those tea leaves, because I don't know what the man is thinking.
I mean, it's interesting that you raised the interim national defense guidance, because I had the same thought that you did, but the question that it raised with me is whether or not making China the pacing threat for defense planning and posture in the Pentagon is incompatible with demanding of Taiwan that it spend 10% of its GDP on defense. Because I think actually both of those things can be parts of a congruent and cohesive strategy. I'm not saying whether or not it's the right strategy, but I think there may be less contradiction there than it appears.
Oh, I totally agree.
On the surface.
I also think it's a question of how and when that actually gets implemented. As someone who helped write a national security strategy,
yes,
I can tell you that it was implemented word for word.
So the other thing that the interim guidance that was leaked from the Pentagon does not exclude is the possibility that the Trump administration will be concerned about the political statements that the government of Taiwan is making. So, that point, I think, even if this administration is willing to do a lot for Taiwan's defense, we don't know what it will demand of Taiwan in return by way of Taiwan's own defense preparations, and it may also have a different attitude toward Taiwan's political statements. It may want to see more effort to resume cross-strait dialogue, which this government doesn't seem to be very interested in. And I think this also relates back to the way we started, which is that the two parties have very divergent theories of the case when it comes to how to provide security. And one party, the DPP, wants to be assertive both in terms of defense preparations and in terms of asserting its sovereignty. The other party, the KMT, it's hard to characterize because there are a bunch of different factions, but generally they want to be more accommodating of China in both respects, both in terms of their material preparations, although some do support, they say, more defense spending, but also in terms of political positioning vis-a-vis Beijing. And I think there are a lot more people in Washington who would like to split the difference, and I'm one of them, have Taiwan do a lot more to prepare itself on defense, but also have it seek some sort of dialogue with the PRC, and at least try to avoid taking steps that could make Beijing fear that Taiwan is creeping closer towards some kind of irrevocable point past which the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party is being challenged through this Taiwanese attempt to assert its permanent separation from the mainland. But it's very hard to see how Taiwan's political system could at least voluntarily adopt that kind of approach.
Yeah, and I think it was really clear when we were there, and I completely agree that that's a really excellent summary of the strategic situation. We often think about the defense side of it, getting Taiwan to do more for its defense. Obviously, that's what we've been asking of our European allies. There's good reasons for that. But in this case, as you pointed out, there's a flip side to it, which is Taiwan also needs to be demonstrating that diplomatically it's willing to go out of its way in order to ensure that we avoid having to come to its rescue, that we avoid having to get into that war with China that would be so destructive. But, so we asked several times our interlocutors, especially on the DPP side, how they felt about cross-strait dialogue. This would be trying to return to the kind of constructive discussions that were going on between Beijing and Taipei from the early 1990s up until around 2016. And just, I'll say off the bat, it's clear that China bears a lot of the responsibility for why these fell apart, but we were in Taiwan, so we were trying to get their sense of it. And I was just surprised that not only their talking points for all the reasons why it was impossible to go back to any kind of dialogue were very well practiced. And what I was surprised about was that they didn't seem to grasp that this is something that the United States might actually really expect them to get to work on because of the fact that A, it's not incompatible with spending more on defense, and B, they really are asking the United States to come to their rescue. It's not just an ask that they're making. The whole basis of the trajectory that their domestic politics is on, both in terms of democracy and in terms of the independence that they so clearly want, is grounded on the idea that the United States is going to come to their rescue. And if they're not doing everything they can to prevent that on the defense and the diplomacy side, I think they're going to run into some challenges of the kind that we were talking about a few minutes ago.
Yeah, I think something I was struck by in listening to especially the DPP interlocutors who, as Stephen said, President Lai has become much more forward-leaning even than President Tsai, who seemed to couch things a little more carefully. And to Chris's point, even then, right, China cut off diplomatic relations almost immediately after her inauguration. So, to give the DPP some credit, they basically said, we're open to dialogue, but China makes it impossible because they insist on a precondition which says that Taiwan needs to accept that they're a one country, two states model, which is basically that Taiwan needs to accept that they will become like Hong Kong. Which, of course, given the crackdown in Hong Kong, especially
after that,
right,
it's not at all helpful.
It's not at all helpful.
Not an attractive option.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think that what struck me about a lot of this was that one of the things that has allowed this pretty untenable situation to exist for decades, right? It is actually kind of remarkable that there hasn't been a violent conflagration so far, is because both sides have allowed ambiguity to exist. Both have said, in the 90s, there was we heard a lot about what was called the 1992 consensus, which is basically both sides agreed, and it was the KMT was the government in power then. Both sides agreed that there is one China, but they also agreed we're not going to have to have an argument over who the real one China is. We're just going to put that to the side and deal with all the other issues. That was an innovative form of ambiguity that has collapsed completely on both sides. Right? On the China side, we've seen the cutting off of diplomatic relations, we've seen the increasing gray zone activities, we've seen the anti-separatist laws. I mean, we've seen a clear encroachment, consistent squeezing of Taiwan.
A lot of pressure, yeah.
A lot of pressure. Yeah. On the Taiwanese side, we've also seen a hardening, right? We've seen a hardening in a very different way towards more explicit language about, President Lai will talk about that Taiwan is already an independent sovereign nation. Less attention played to some of the semantics that China cares about. More of a hardening even in how the Taiwanese people think about this, right? As we said, the majority of the Taiwanese people support the status quo. If you look at the group that doesn't, vastly more support independence than do eventual reunification. I think it's at 7% according to INDSR right
really
now.
Small numbers for both.
Tiny. Yeah, it's like 20-something percent for independence, 7% for, right. But and so I think there just becomes less ambiguous space for an impossible situation to exist in, which really highlights the sort of untenability of the status quo at the moment.
No, it's ripe for political actors on either side to disturb that status quo, and political actors from the United States, as we've seen in the recent past. But I was really struck by one conversation we had with a kind of progressive left DPP-affiliated journalist and activist. This was
in that bar.
Right, who in that
home road bar. That was fun.
Exactly. But who, clearly was pro-independence. And then we asked, okay, so what's the pathway? And he said, well, there's no path right now to achieving this. So there's at least a pragmatic, a level of pragmatism to say, well, at the moment, there's no path to this. And that was one of the most interesting things I think we heard.
I was kind of like, well, then why are you talking about it? Because it's going to create a lot of problems.
No, that's right. Because again, I mean, this is something that has a large political constituency, so it does make sense. I mean, I think this is where, where good, responsible leaders do make a difference. That's a challenge right now in Taiwan's polarized politics. But again, in thinking about, okay, what is the correct policy? What should we support? We being the United States, or we the policy community here in Washington. I mean, that is just an unsatisfactory status quo, and something changes at some point that shakes loose the possibility of some other better policy outcome. But it's hard to really write that report.
Yeah, the two other explanations we heard for how this changes in the end, we had a KMT person said that pretty much everybody said we have to kick the can down the road, right? Like nothing good is going to happen now. Yeah. But a KMT person said after Xi Jinping is gone, there's a chance that the Chinese people at some point will recognize that they want to be a democracy, right? And so they'll want what we have. That was one version, which seemed...
But it was sort of like, how is that going to happen?
Again, that was...
Sounds good, but when and how is that going to happen?
The other one from a DPP person was, she basically said, that seems unlikely, and if it were likely, it's going to happen a long time from now. Instead, right now, I think she said, and I haven't independently checked this, but she said about 20% of mainland Chinese people have said they don't care what happens to Taiwan. And so she said, at some point in the future, probably after Xi Jinping, the goal will be for that to grow exponentially, and just the Chinese people will not care what happens to Taiwan. China will have to deal with its own internal issues, whether they're demographic issues, economic issues, things like that. And so it just won't be that much of a focus.
Yeah, these arguments really concern me. Because they're ways of allowing people to not deal with the China that we see in front of us. And we have no really good reason to think that China is going to transform into something fundamentally different. 20% of a population believes just about anything you can pull, right? So I understand that there is a need to think about the end game, the future, and a need to create some sort of story that would underpin a modus operandi in Taiwanese politics and cross-strait relations. So the story, for that strategic purpose, the story that one day something will change in China and unification could be a possibility is not a bad story, so long as you don't really believe it's going to happen and have a certain time horizon on it, for those purposes specifically, right? But otherwise, you're left with the reality of trying to manage the de facto self-rule that Taiwan, thank goodness, enjoys. And, the status quo is eroding to such a point that it's kind of hard to see it going on like this. So I worry about the stories people tell themselves to avoid confronting the question, what exactly is driving the PRC's behavior? Is it so obvious that the PRC is just in a vacuum trying to envelop Taiwan? Or are the things that Taiwan might do or the United States might do that make a difference to the amount of pressure, to the timeline, to the near-term goals that Beijing has?
It's an important point, because it's almost as if we, Taiwan, you, the United States, have no agency in this. It's just because the PRC is going to do what it's going to do. They're going to keep up the pressure, and any show of accommodation that we should put forward is only going to embolden them. I mean, that was a common theme that we heard from many people, but it means it sort of absolves their political leadership from doing things which obviously are difficult within Taiwanese politics, but that probably need to be done.
We heard from multiple people the phrase "Taiwan's fate is not its own," which I thought was interesting, because to a certain extent they are caught between two global superpowers, right? Its fate is not solely its own, but its fate is not solely its own. Right? It has a role to play in its own fate.
Yep. I wonder if we should talk a little bit about the military side of it, since it's Taiwan, and we did have some great conversations with some people who are really smart on the military question. The obvious starting point is, like we were saying earlier, the gray zone activities that China has been pursuing in the Taiwan Straits and around it are intensifying pressure on Taiwan. This is a real problem. One of the things that was driven home to me is the concern that these exercises could suddenly turn into something more than just an exercise, and Taiwan would already, the PLA would already have crossed the Taiwan Strait and be in a much greater, stronger position to strategically surprise Taiwan, the United States, and the rest of our allies in the region with some kind of a blockade or an actual invasion. So it's a really big problem, and I don't want to diminish it. One of the things that was interesting to me was the extent to which nearly everyone we talked to about the military issue made it a point of insisting on how important those conventional legacy systems were, the F-16s, naval systems, and so forth and so on.
I agree with those who say that Taiwan needs to retain some legacy systems. They're right. They do need to do something to contest gray zone operations by the PLA.
Seems silly to have no Air Force or Navy.
It's a good idea.
You're an island.
So I'm with them, but from the conversations we had, and we certainly didn't speak to everybody in the course of a week, I didn't hear a way of trying to balance the competing demands, that we need to find some way to limit what Taiwan will do to contest gray zone activities, so that some limiting principle that would allow Taiwan to focus on a porcupine defense, to focus on building a reserve force, which it really needs to do, et cetera. People seemed concerned with the problem, and I didn't see a way to manage those competing demands.
Yeah, I mean, this is not strictly military, but one of the things we also heard was how much Lai has invested in a kind of, society resilience strategy, not just a military response, but, a society that can respond to various types of scenarios, and how this has opened up other opportunities and channels for Taiwan's relationships around the world, including with countries that are very nervous about any kind of military-to-military cooperation, because that's something that would annoy China, and China would seek reprisals against whatever countries did that. But looking at a kind of whole-of-society approach, again, has opened up channels of communication at the civil society level, at the governmental
Europeans,
level,
if I remember correctly.
Europeans
Yeah.
and elsewhere. Being able to talk to other governments, other countries that have dealt with different, whether it's natural disaster or whatever, has been kind of a boon for Taiwan's diplomacy.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I also found interesting is, obviously the PLA is doing these military exercises, but Taiwan is going to be doing apparently a civil defense exercise this summer, sort of whole of society approach, which has not been done before. So, as you said, President Lai is really focused on this, even as at the sort of military level, I think there's still questions about the legacy versus asymmetric approach.
I mean, I think the politics of it are pretty interesting because I sense, the reluctance of the KMT to get totally involved with this and the enthusiasm of President Lai. I mean, clearly, if you've got people out there, drilling sort of the way that some of us did during the Cold War, get under the desk kind of stuff, it immediately raises the question of, well, why are we doing this? And so it is a way of inculcating a sort of sense of, yes, civic responsibility, but also nationalism against a particular external threat, which clearly plays into the politics.
And a sense of the stakes, right? Because, I mean, this, goes to what we were talking about. I mean, there could be some benefits in making clear to people, like, this is what we would face in this scenario, and it's not gret that some politicians are playing a little bit too close to the edge.
Yeah, that's an really interesting point, Matt. On the question of one of the things that was said to us, which was sort of a smaller detail, but really stuck in my head, was that because Taiwan is behind on the cost curve and that the need to respond to Chinese gray zone activities is wearing out their military kit, they're going to need to loosen their rules of engagement. In other words, this person was advocating for allowing Taiwanese pilots and presumably also naval vessels to be much more aggressive when they intercept their Chinese counterparts. And the idea was, well, this would raise the risks for China and they would do less of these gray zone activities. And that was a moment where I said, well, I can see the interest from Taiwan's perspective, but from a U.S. perspective, this sounds like a really bad idea. I mean, what did you guys, do you remember this?
I was terrified by that. Yeah, the risks of escalation there, misperception, accident is just crazy.
It seems to me that we don't want to have that happen. I mean, hopefully we would be able to, to control it, but the state of, our emergency military communications, last I checked, remains pretty weak.
Yeah, I also think it's not an easy problem. How do you deal with gray zone activities? And one of the theories we heard was essentially a psychological theory, that the point of contesting PLA gray zone operations is to maintain the resolve of Taiwan's population.
Right.
And I really have to wonder whether, the number of F-16s that you scramble really has an effect on Taiwan's will to fight.
Or what the effect is. I mean, I get it. I mean, they're sort of saying, if we don't do this, it's going to make us everybody's going to feel really weak and vulnerable to China. But the fact that they're constantly having to do this and constantly talking about the threat is also making people feel very threatened. As we reflect on the trip, the big thing is I come away more concerned, not less. And it makes me think about where we would want things to be if we were to go back in 5 or 10 years. I mean, Stephen, you wrote this article that everybody was talking about when we were there in Foreign Affairs. You want to take a stab at that?
Well, if you go by what my co-author Jennifer Kavanaugh and I recommend, here's where we'd get in about 10 years. First of all, Taiwan would make much greater efforts to make itself a porcupine, make itself indigestible to an outside invasion.
This is militarily.
Exactly.
Right.
That would give it confidence that it would be pretty insane for Beijing to try an all-out invasion. So it could worry perhaps a little bit less about even gray zone activities and considerably less about being helpless in the event of a cross-strait invasion. It would also potentially put its relationship with Washington on a more stable footing, because the United States would have more options in the event of a crisis. Taiwan would not be left praying that the United States comes to the rescue and having to also fight off the PLA for a while until the United States arrived. It could hold its own for a good period of time, perhaps be resupplied by the United States in the event of a crisis. And so then I think that would put Taiwan in a better position vis-a-vis its two very difficult great power neighbors, so to speak, China and the United States. And it could also, you can see that around that kind of a platform, one could imagine, if you really want to fantasize, the two parties finding some degree of convergence. But to say
you mean
in
domestic politics?
Exactly,
Yeah,
the DPP and the KMT. But that 10 years is a long way away from what we saw a few weeks ago.
Matt, you want to take a stab at this?
Sure.
I mean, if you were to go back in 5 years,
Yeah.
what would make you happy or unhappy?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are definitely elements of what Stephen and Jennifer wrote in their piece. Stronger investments in Taiwan's defense, certainly investments in its own resilience. One of the things we haven't mentioned yet is there's apparently an effort now to extend the amount of time that is required for national service for all young Taiwanese. Right now it's about 4 months, which one person referred to as just a kind of summer camp where they go and hang out and do drills, and that's their national service.
Shot a rifle once or twice.
Right,
yeah,
exactly,
yeah.
and to extend that
Did
to
a lot of
one or
PT,
2
yeah,
years as a lot of other countries do. But also it's just understanding that, I mean, given the various scenarios, the kind of least bad scenario is kind of what we have now, with a few, maybe some changes, as we just mentioned. Also having a president of Taiwan who is really willing to try harder to have engagement with Beijing, which Taiwan does not have now, unfortunately. I think that would be good that opens possibilities in talks with Beijing, but also I think that would have benefits in terms of U.S. public opinion and global opinion as well. And I do think that matters. But I think, coming from like a D.C. perspective, the idea of just there's not much we can do and we should kind of keep this unsatisfying status quo as it is not a very attractive argument either there or here. And yet that is, I think, probably the best option.
Best option, yeah. I mean, one of the things that, we haven't talked about as much is the politics of this, not just Taiwan's democracy and progress and success as democracy, but also how closely that's linked to eventual independence and the dream of independence. And one of the things that we heard so often was, especially from the DPP, well, this is what the people want, and so what that says is, well, so the Taiwanese people are eventually going to vote in favor of independence. That's a huge, that's a huge challenge. I mean, obviously they're doing that incrementally, but if that force is really there, it's a real problem. And so as leaders, as political leaders, I understand your desire to respond to the will of the people, but you also have a responsibility to lead the people and to have some say in what they think. And so I felt as though occasionally the political leadership was maybe a little bit too hands-off in terms of, the way in which they were not doing enough to try to shape political opinion on this really, really crucial issue.
Yeah, I think, Matt, you're saying how unsatisfying it is you're saying like kind of keep doing the same thing for this unsatisfying status quo. I think it will take an enormous amount of hard work to even preserve that unsatisfying status quo, because all forces, including political forces, just military forces, everything is pressing towards resolving that status quo. And the sooner that is resolved, the worse it is for Taiwan, right? Like that, the resolution does not go well.
There's no way in which the resolution goes well. I
Right.
mean, I just don't see how that happens. I didn't hear a compelling story for how the resolution would go well for Taiwan.
Exactly. And so I think as we think through what is the hard work that has to be done to preserve this, pretty unsatisfying approach especially for a democracy with people who are extremely proud of creating this democracy, who have a vibrant culture where most people at this point now identify as Taiwanese, not Chinese, right? That is going to be unsatisfying. And there's a lot of domestic political work, I think, that has to get done, not just on the DPP side, but also largely on the DPP side, just because they have the majority of political power
Right.
at this point, to actually work with and kind of give some credibility to an opposition, if that makes sense. Not in terms of saying vote for the KMT, but thinking through a democracy is not healthy, right? If you only have one party kind of in charge, where as we talked to a lot of folks, most people saw very little future for the KMT, especially among young people. It's just young people are with the DPP in terms of Taiwan's eventual independence, sovereignty, things like that. What does it look like to have a viable two-party system where there is, a loyal opposition? Again, going back to Matt's point earlier, would that we also had that here, a really strong two-party system where we're arguing over policy principles and not over the viability of the other party. But again, these are the struggles of democracy, and I think that's what Taiwan is going to have to reckon with as they're trying to maintain this current status.
That's really insightful. I mean, I just was reminded again how high the stakes are in this situation. I mean, given the commitment of really both political parties here in the United States to stronger and stronger backing of Taiwan that we've seen over the course of recent years, and my own deep concern about what a war with China would really look like, as opposed to the way that we sometimes hear it talked about, the fact that it would be a world historical event. I just came away more concerned about Taiwan even than I was before going, for all the reasons that we've been talking about.
Can I just make one other point? A lot of the conversations we had were very U.S.-centric, and we're Americans, so that made sense. I do think, though, that, I left with some questions about whether Taiwanese elites appreciate the importance of managing the perception of Taiwan in cross-strait relations in a regional context. It would be very important to Taiwan that if there were to be a large conflict, that countries around Taiwan would perceive the PRC to have been the aggressor. And it is not obvious that they necessarily will. I think the visit of Nancy Pelosi to Taipei in 2023 is instructive. I've had a lot of conversations with people in different parts of East Asia and Southeast Asia in which they said something like the following. Initially I thought it was good to see Nancy Pelosi show support to Taiwan, but look, it didn't make anybody else safer. It didn't make Taiwan safer. It provided the perfect pretext or even rationale for the PLA to increase its military activities. Taiwan lost the median line as a result. And so I think, if there's kind of an event that provides a good litmus test for thinking strategically about Taiwan's situation and the way in which unwise actions from Taiwan's or the United States' side can make Taiwan less secure, that Pelosi visit stood out to be as a turning point and something that people still need to analyze.
All right, so obviously a lot of this revolves around what the United States is going to do in the future, and especially some of the uncertainties surrounding Donald Trump's intentions for his relationship, or America's relationship with Beijing, and obviously Taiwan is a key function of this. He has a new kind of foreign policy, we can say that. How do you think that's going to play out for Taiwan? Matt, what do you think?
Yeah, I think as we mentioned earlier, he has, I think, surprisingly not said very much about China or Taiwan in his first couple months in office, given the prominent role that China policy played in his first term. That will clearly change. But what we've seen so far from him is, whether we're talking about Russia and Ukraine or Israel and Gaza, is he takes, strong countries or at least as he perceives, strong countries and strong leaders seriously, and they're the ones who make the decisions, and less less strong countries or less strong populations just have to deal with the decisions that those powerful countries make. And that could have some pretty bad consequences for Taiwan, which is, again, why I think their decision to kind of move very early to demonstrate that they've got cards is a pretty wise one.
It serves them well, yeah, certainly. Whether it's enough,
Yeah.
another question entirely. Another question entirely.
And again, I think, Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0, as we've discussed both on our trip and just together, look very different and hard to read onto the second what happened in the first. But in 2016, right, Trump actually made explicit exactly what you were talking about. He said, basically Taiwan could just be part of some grand bargain with Beijing, right? He was very willing to think about it as a bargaining chip in a larger deal. So who knows if he returns to that.
Yeah, I think that is the scenario that Taiwan should be worried about, that Xi Jinping decides to make some kind of demands on Trump in exchange for a larger grand bargain, so there'd be linkage to some other non-Taiwan issue, and Trump kind of figures, well, I didn't care about Taiwan that much in the first place, so let me get what I really do want, probably in the trade space. That said, I also think there is a possibility that some U.S.-China negotiation over Taiwan could have a positive outcome and shouldn't just be viewed as a source of trouble. It could certainly be that, but an exchange of assurances between Washington and Beijing that would help to convey that the U.S. one China policy is strong and durable, perhaps in exchange for China reducing some of its military activities around Taiwan or declaring that it has no timetable to achieve unification or something else. That could actually help the situation and be one of the ingredients that gets us off of what in a lot of moments looked like a collision course.
I agree. I think that Taiwan has got, when it comes to the Trump administration, as we talked about, Brett, and as you laid out, clearly understood the importance of its $100 billion investment in the U.S. It's got other dimensions of this that are all going to be helpful to it. Is serious about increasing its investment in its defense sector, but this is sort of the missing component, is trying to demonstrate that they're also serious about the diplomatic angle here. And I think, Stephen, you just laid out some of the ways in which it's probably worth trying to pursue that. And I would favor the Trump administration actually strongly encouraging Taipei to take those steps, despite the reluctance that we've seen, and we know that it'll be different, but it would be a more positive outcome for everyone involved if they were willing to do so. So guys, it was really fun to have you guys on the trip. Learned a lot, had some good laughs. We'll have to talk about the Stephen meter another time.
Yeah.
Yep.
Best meal?
Best meal. I don't know that we have consensus on that.
I mean, there's a lot of national pride
Individual.
in Din
Stickers,
Tai
I
Fung.
think.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Dumplings. Yeah, soup dumplings.
Dumplings were good too.
Although I think Chris developed a bubble tea addiction.
It's
while we were
true.
there.
Yeah,
I
we
did.
turned.
I know.
Chris was turned into
I
a
had a
bubble tea
weakness.
fan.
I never knew the weakness I had for the bubble tea. So next time we go, the
Yeah.
DPP knows how they can get me to say nice things by giving me bubble tea at every meeting.
Caffeine,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sugar.
sugar, what
Yeah.
can go
It
wrong?
was
Yeah.
really awfully good, I gotta say.
Mm-hmm.
This has been a new podcast version of our series Pivotal States, in which we look at U.S. strategic options towards the most important countries in the world. I hope you'll tune in again if you've enjoyed this installment when we talk about America's longstanding special relationship with the United Kingdom.